The woman didn't remember giving him her address. That was the first thing that made Calvin Brooks consider pulling over and calling the police instead. She had spent the last 15 minutes sitting quietly in the passenger seat of his aging pickup, her forehead resting against the cool window, one hand clutching a leather portfolio, as though it contained something too important to lose. Every few blocks she whispered, almost to herself, "Please, just home. Nothing else. No explanation. No complaint. No fear." Just those two words spoken with the exhaustion of someone who had finally run out of strength. Calvin tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His 10-year-old daughter, Nia, would already be asleep at their apartment, watched over by the retired neighbor who had insisted he finish his late maintenance shift without worrying. He should have gone straight home after work. Instead, he'd found this stranger sitting alone on a rain-soaked bench outside a closed art museum, her dress damp from the drizzle, ignoring every rideshare that stopped for her. When he asked if she needed help, she looked straight through him before quietly handing him a house key and murmuring a street name. Most people would have kept walking. Calvin never had that luxury. Life had taught him that if someone needed help, you helped first and sorted out the complications later. 20 minutes after leaving downtown, the neighborhood changed. Historic brick sidewalks replaced busy storefronts. Tall oak trees stretched over the street, their branches dripping with rainwater that shimmered beneath the yellow glow of old-fashioned lamps. Expensive homes stood behind iron gates, each one larger than the last. Calvin glanced again at the address glowing on the dashboard navigation. It couldn't be right. A woman who had looked so completely lost didn't belong somewhere like this. Yet the numbers matched perfectly. He eased the truck to the curb in front of a stately Victorian home with white columns and dark green shutters. The porch light switched on before he even turned off the engine. That tiny detail made his stomach tighten. Someone had been watching, carefully, waiting. The woman slowly opened her eyes. For the first time all evening, they focused clearly. She looked at the house, then at Calvin, and managed the faintest smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steadier than before. She stepped out before he could offer to walk her inside. Calvin hesitated only a second before following several steps behind, unwilling to leave until he knew she'd reached the door safely. She climbed the porch with surprising confidence and knocked once. No hesitation, no fumbling for keys, as if she'd decided not to use them at all. Inside, footsteps approached. Slow, measured, heavy enough to belong to someone older. Calvin instinctively stopped at the bottom step. Rain collected along the brim of his work jacket while the porch light cast long shadows across the polished wood. The lock clicked. The door opened just wide enough for a silver-haired woman to appear. She stared first at the woman Calvin had brought home. Then her eyes lifted past her shoulder. They landed on Calvin's face. Every trace of color drained from hers. Her hand slipped against the edge of the door as though she'd suddenly forgotten how to stand. Then she whispered one word that Calvin hadn't heard spoken to him in nearly 20 years. "Calvin." Calvin did not answer. For a long second, he simply stood there while rainwater slipped from the edge of his jacket onto the old wooden porch, his mind refusing to connect the woman standing in front of him with the memory he had carried for nearly 2 decades. Evelyn Brooks looked smaller than he remembered. The sharp confidence that had once filled every room she entered had been replaced by careful movements and tired eyes that seemed to have spent years waiting for something they no longer expected to receive. Behind her, the woman Calvin had driven home quietly removed her shoes without saying a word, as though this strange silence between mother and son was not surprising to her at all. That confused him more than anything. How did this stranger know his mother? Why had she never reacted when he told her his first name during the drive? Why had she chosen not to tell him whose house this really was? Evelyn finally found her voice. "You should not be standing out there in the rain." It was not an apology. It was not a welcome either. It sounded like someone reaching for the safest sentence she could find. Calvin glanced toward the driveway. Every instinct told him to leave before old wounds reopened. He had spent 19 years building a quiet life, where his daughter never had to witness the kind of arguments that had once filled his childhood home. He intended to keep it that way. "She made it home safely," he said calmly, taking one slow step backward. "That is all I came to do." The woman he had helped turned immediately toward him. "Please do not go." Her voice was clear now, almost startlingly so, stripped of the exhaustion that had weighed it down all evening. She looked from Calvin to Evelyn before lowering her eyes toward the leather portfolio she still held tightly against her chest. There are things both of you deserve to know. Calvin felt the familiar pressure building behind his ribs, the warning that came whenever the past threatened to pull him backward. He had heard promises like that before. They usually ended with someone asking him to forgive something impossible. Evelyn noticed the hesitation in his eyes. Instead of moving closer, she stepped aside from the doorway. It was a small gesture, but Calvin recognized it immediately. When he was a boy, that was how she silently admitted she had been wrong without saying the words aloud. He had not seen her do it since the day he walked out carrying nothing except a duffel bag and his father's old watch. His gaze dropped instinctively toward her hands. The watch was there, not on her wrist, but resting on a narrow hallway table just inside the entrance beside an old brass key and a faded postcard he recognized before he could stop himself. He had written that postcard 20 years earlier from basic training. It had never been answered. He had believed she had thrown it away. So why was it sitting where she could see it every day? Before Calvin could ask, headlights swept across the front yard. A black sedan rolled slowly to the curb behind his pickup. The engine shut off, but nobody climbed out immediately. Seconds later, the driver's door opened, and a tall man in an expensive charcoal overcoat stepped into the rain carrying a slim folder under one arm. The moment Claire saw him, every trace of relief vanished from her face. She tightened her grip on the portfolio and whispered with unmistakable fear, "He found me." Claire did not wait for anyone to tell her what to do. She stepped off the porch into the rain before the man in the charcoal overcoat could reach the front walk, placing herself between him and the house with a determination that had been completely absent only minutes earlier. Calvin watched the change carefully. Whatever had clouded her mind earlier was gone now, replaced by the alertness of someone protecting something worth losing everything for. The stranger slowed several yards away and offered a polite smile that somehow made the night feel colder. "Claire," he called evenly, "you left before we could finish our conversation." She tightened her grip on the leather portfolio until her knuckles turned pale. The conversation was over. Calvin could have walked away. Nothing required him to stay. His daughter was waiting at home. Tomorrow's shift started before sunrise, and every instinct warned him that remaining here would drag him back into a past he had fought too hard to escape. Yet he noticed something almost invisible. Claire had quietly moved the portfolio behind her back the moment the man appeared. Whatever was inside mattered more than her own comfort. Without announcing himself or trying to play the hero, Calvin stepped onto the lowest porch step, placing his broad frame naturally between Claire and the entrance without blocking anyone or raising his voice. "She said the conversation is over," he said calmly. "Tonight is not the night." The man studied Calvin from head to toe. Mud on the work boots, faded work jacket, calloused hands. Everything about Calvin suggested an ordinary laborer, but something in his steady posture made the stranger reconsider taking another step. Evelyn noticed it too. She had seen that quiet stance before, years ago, whenever Calvin had decided someone weaker than himself deserved protection even if it cost him. The stranger smiled again, though this one never reached his eyes. "I have no interest in causing trouble," he replied. "I simply need the documents she removed from our office." Claire answered before Calvin could speak. "They are not your documents." Another question surfaced immediately. If they were not his, why had she taken them? If she had not stolen them, what was she protecting? Rain continued to fall between them until the stranger finally reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a business card. He extended it toward Calvin instead of Claire. "When you discover you are standing in the middle of something much larger than you understand, call me." Calvin accepted the card only because refusing it would accomplish nothing. The man returned to his sedan and drove away without another word. Claire released a slow breath she had apparently been holding for miles. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "Now he knows your face." Calvin looked at the card beneath the porch light. It carried only a name, Adrian Mercer, followed by the logo of Donovan Heritage Foundation. Donovan, the same last name Claire had given him when he asked where to take her. Before he could ask whether Mercer worked for her family or against it, his phone vibrated sharply inside his pocket. The caller was his neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. Calvin answered immediately. Her voice trembled. "Calvin, I am so sorry. Nia woke up looking for you, and someone just came to the apartment asking questions about where you were tonight." They knew your full name before I ever opened the door. Icy concern settled over Calvin faster than the rain ever could. Mrs. Alvarez rarely sounded frightened, yet now every word arrived in uneven breaths. She explained that the stranger had been polite, well-dressed, and strangely informed. He had asked whether Calvin always worked late on Thursdays, whether Nia attended Jefferson Elementary, and whether Calvin still drove the old blue pickup parked outside Building 4. He never threatened anyone. He simply smiled, thanked her for her time, and left after noticing the security camera above the apartment entrance. That detail unsettled Calvin. Even more, whoever the man was, he wanted people to remember how reasonable he had appeared. Calvin ended the call and immediately dialed Nia's smartwatch. She answered on the second ring with the sleepy voice only children have after being awakened unexpectedly. "Daddy, Miss Elena said you were helping somebody." Calvin smiled despite the knot tightening inside his chest. "I am, sweetheart. Lock the apartment door, stay with Miss Elena, and do not answer anyone else tonight. I will be there soon." Nia hesitated. "Daddy, somebody left flowers outside our door." Flowers. Not a note. Not a package. Flowers. It felt almost ordinary, which somehow made it more disturbing. Calvin promised he was on his way before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Claire had overheard enough to understand the situation. The color drained from her face. "This is because of me." Calvin shook his head. "Maybe. Maybe not. Guessing will not help my daughter." Evelyn stepped farther into the hallway and reached for the leather portfolio. Claire instinctively pulled it back. That tiny movement answered another question before anyone spoke. Even Evelyn did not know what was inside. "If those papers are causing this," Evelyn said quietly, "the police should have them." Claire lowered her eyes. "I tried." Her answer hung in the air. Tried? Why had the police refused? Or had someone stopped them? She slowly opened the portfolio just enough for Calvin to glimpse several property maps, handwritten notes, and one cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, in elegant handwriting, was a name that stole Evelyn's breath. Thomas Brooks, Calvin's late father. His eyes narrowed immediately. His father had been gone for 23 years. Why would a sealed envelope addressed to him still exist? Before anyone could ask another question, headlights swept across the front windows again. This time they were accompanied by flashing amber lights rather than luxury sedans. A city utility truck rolled to a stop across the street, followed by two maintenance vans. Workers stepped out wearing reflective jackets, studying a clipboard beneath the porch light. One of them pointed directly toward Evelyn's house. Calvin recognized the company logo instantly. It was the same regional contractor that managed emergency utility shutoffs, and crews almost never worked after 11 at night unless ordered by the city. The foreman approached with visible discomfort. "I apologize for the hour," he said, "but we received an emergency authorization to disconnect power to this property immediately." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. "There must be some mistake. My account has always been current." The foreman looked genuinely embarrassed. "According to the order, this home is scheduled for immediate seizure at sunrise." He handed Evelyn the official notice. Calvin glanced at the signature approving the emergency action. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, because he recognized the name at the bottom before anyone else did. Adrian Mercer. Calvin accepted the notice without arguing with the foreman. Years of solving equipment failures had taught him that shouting at the person delivering bad news never fixed the machine behind it. Instead, he studied every page under the porch light while the utility crew waited in uncomfortable silence. The authorization looked authentic. Official seals, correct formatting, digital approval codes. Yet one detail refused to fit. The emergency order had been processed only 37 minutes earlier, barely enough time for 3 separate crews to receive instructions and arrive. Someone had anticipated exactly where Claire would go long before she reached this house. That realization shifted everything. This was not a random legal dispute. Someone had been guiding the night toward this address. Claire noticed where Calvin's eyes had stopped. "You found it too," she said quietly. She pointed to the approval timestamp. "That order existed before Adrian Mercer ever spoke to us outside." Evelyn leaned against the doorway as if the strength had slowly drained from her legs. "Then he already knew you would come here." Claire nodded once. "No, he knew I would eventually bring the portfolio here." Calvin looked again at the leather case resting against her side. What makes those papers worth following across the city? Claire hesitated long enough for the silence to become its own answer. They are not valuable because of what they say, she admitted. They are valuable because of what they prove never happened. That single sentence created more questions than it answered. Prove what never happened? How could missing events matter more than recorded ones? The utility foreman cleared his throat apologetically. I can delay disconnecting service for a few minutes while you gather medication or personal belongings, but I cannot ignore the order completely. Calvin thanked him without asking for special treatment. His calm surprised the workers, who quietly stepped back to give the family privacy. Even strangers could sense this was no ordinary eviction. Inside the foyer, Evelyn carefully opened the cream-colored envelope addressed to Thomas Brooks. The wax seal cracked with a sound so soft it almost disappeared beneath the rain. Instead of unfolding the letter immediately, something smaller slipped onto the hardwood floor. Calvin bent down and picked it up. It was a safety deposit box key attached to a faded brass tag engraved with the number 214. Nothing else. No bank name. No address. Only the number. Evelyn covered her mouth. Your father told me he destroyed that key. Claire looked genuinely confused. Destroyed it? Then why would it be hidden inside a sealed letter? Calvin turned the tiny key over in his palm. The edges were polished smooth from years of use before someone had carefully preserved it. Whatever waited inside that deposit box had been important enough for his father to conceal, yet equally important for someone to recover decades later. His phone vibrated again. This time it was not Mrs. Alvarez. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number from downtown Charleston. Calvin answered cautiously. A composed female voice introduced herself as an attorney from the county probate court. She apologized for the late hour before asking a question that made every person in the hallway fall silent. Mr. Brooks, can you confirm whether you are currently in possession of the original key left by your father? Because if you are, someone filed paperwork exactly 1 hour ago claiming you died 7 years ago. Calvin ended the call without taking his eyes off the small brass key resting in his palm. The attorney had promised to email copies of the probate filing within minutes, and true to her word, his phone chimed almost immediately. He opened the first document beneath the porch light, while Claire and Evelyn watched in silence. There it was in black and white. A certified petition declaring Calvin Brooks legally deceased, complete with forged supporting records, an outdated apartment address, and signatures from witnesses he had never met. The rain continued falling, but the world around him suddenly felt unnaturally still. Someone had not merely wanted his father's hidden property. Someone had first erased Calvin himself. Claire stepped closer, studying the screen without touching it. That explains why Mercer was never interested in finding you, she whispered. He needed everyone else to believe you no longer existed. Evelyn slowly lowered herself onto the hallway bench, her hands trembling around the opened envelope. Thomas always said the safest way to protect something was to make people stop looking for it. Calvin looked at his mother. Then he knew this would happen. She nodded reluctantly. He knew people would come one day. He just did not know when. Another email arrived. This one contained a scanned inventory from Safety Deposit Box 214. The contents were listed but sealed from public view by court order. Only 3 items appeared on the inventory sheet. 1 handwritten journal, 1 notarized property agreement, and 1 recorded statement deposited 23 years earlier with instructions to release it only if Calvin personally presented the original key. Suddenly, the tiny piece of brass in his hand carried more weight than anything else in the house. The utility foreman approached again, removing his hard hat respectfully. Mr. Brooks, I just received another update from dispatch. Calvin expected another demand to disconnect the power. Instead, the foreman looked genuinely confused. The seizure order has been suspended. Claire frowned. Suspended. The foreman turned his tablet so they could all see the notice. The cancellation had been issued only 2 minutes earlier by the county clerk's office, citing an active inheritance dispute requiring immediate judicial review. Everything changed at once. The workers quietly returned to their trucks. The pressure that had surrounded the house only moments before seemed to dissolve. Yet Calvin felt no relief. If the order had been withdrawn this quickly, it meant someone powerful was watching events unfold in real time. Inside the parked sedan at the far end of the block, a faint glow appeared behind the windshield before disappearing again. Someone was still there. Someone was waiting. Claire followed Calvin's gaze. He is not leaving because he thinks we will make the decision for him. Calvin slipped the brass key into his pocket. What decision? Claire looked directly at him for the first time since they met outside the museum. Tomorrow morning the probate court will open box 214. The person holding that key decides whether the truth stays buried forever or becomes part of the public record. Evelyn closed her eyes. If those records become public, powerful families will lose fortunes. Calvin's thoughts immediately turned to Nia. He had promised his daughter a quiet life built on honesty, not courtrooms and hidden enemies. Yet walking away would mean surrendering the only proof his father had spent decades protecting. His phone vibrated one final time. This message contained no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence beneath a photograph of Nia leaving school earlier that week. Bring the key to the courthouse alone, or your daughter will learn the truth before you do. Calvin deleted the anonymous message without replying. Whoever had sent it wanted fear to make the next decision for him, and he refused to let that happen. He called Mrs. Alvarez once more, asking her to keep Nia inside until he arrived. Then he looked at Claire. Tomorrow I go to the courthouse exactly as planned. Tonight, I go home to my daughter. Claire lowered her head. She understood the price of that choice. If Calvin walked away now, Mercer would have hours to prepare for whatever waited inside safety deposit. Box 214. If Calvin rushed toward the inheritance instead, he would break the promise he had made only minutes earlier to the person who mattered most. Evelyn quietly crossed the room and disappeared down the hallway. When she returned, she carried an old canvas satchel Calvin recognized immediately. It had belonged to his father, and he had not seen it since the day he left home. Without a word, she handed it to him. Inside rested a folded railroad map covered with handwritten notes, a worn flashlight, and a small spiral notebook filled with maintenance schedules from decades earlier. Calvin almost dismissed the contents as ordinary until Claire gently turned one page sideways. Hidden among columns of inspection dates was a repeating sequence of numbers. They matched the identification code printed on the probate inventory. The notebook had never been a maintenance log. It had been a cipher hiding instructions in plain sight. Suddenly, Thomas Brooks no longer seemed like a man protecting money. He had been protecting information. Claire looked at Evelyn with growing disbelief. You knew he was leaving clues. Evelyn shook her head slowly. I knew he was leaving hope. I never knew where. Outside, the utility crews finished packing their equipment. Before climbing into his truck, the foreman walked back to the porch carrying a sealed envelope that another driver had mistakenly left behind. This was addressed to the homeowner, he explained. It was mixed in with the cancellation notice. Evelyn opened it carefully. There was no letter inside. Only a courthouse visitor badge already printed with Calvin's full name and tomorrow's date. Across the bottom, someone had stamped the words witness access approved. Calvin frowned. He had never requested courtroom access. Someone inside the courthouse expected him to be there long before he received the official call. Another question surfaced immediately. Who was helping him from the inside? And why were they risking their own career? Claire suddenly remembered something and reached into the leather portfolio. She removed a folded photograph that had been tucked beneath the property maps all along. It showed Thomas Brooks standing beside three other people outside an unfinished civic building 24 years earlier. One face belonged to Thomas. Another belonged to a much younger Evelyn. The third was unfamiliar. Calvin's attention stopped on the fourth person. Although the photograph had faded badly, the resemblance was unmistakable. Adrian Mercer was standing there as a young man, smiling beside Calvin's father as though they had once trusted each other completely. Every assumption Calvin had made collapsed in an instant. Mercer had not entered this story as an outsider. He had been part of it from the beginning. Before anyone could absorb the discovery, headlights illuminated the front windows again. This time it was not a luxury sedan or a utility truck. A marked county sheriff's vehicle stopped at the curb. Two deputies stepped onto the sidewalk, and the older of the two removed his hat before looking directly at Calvin. Mr. Brooks, he said gravely, the chief judge has issued an emergency order. You need to come with us immediately. Someone tried to open safety deposit box 214 tonight. Calvin rode with the deputies through the quiet streets before dawn, the brass key resting in his pocket like a promise his father had entrusted to him years before he understood its weight. When they reached the county courthouse, the atmosphere was strangely calm. There were no flashing cameras, no shouting attorneys. Only a handful of officials gathered outside the secured records vault. The chief judge greeted Calvin with a tired expression that carried more regret than authority. Someone attempted to access Box 214 using forged probate documents, she explained. The vault's supervisor refused because one condition could never be forged. Your father required the original key and your physical presence together. Calvin removed the worn brass key and placed it gently on the polished counter. The lock turned with a quiet click that echoed through the silent room. Inside rested exactly what the inventory had promised. The journal, the notarized property agreement, the sealed recording. Nothing more, nothing less. The judge invited everyone into a private hearing room before pressing play. Thomas Brooks' voice filled the room with the calm confidence Calvin remembered from childhood. He explained that decades earlier, several influential developers had pressured local families to surrender inherited land through fraudulent filings. Rather than expose them immediately and place innocent people in danger, he had gathered certified evidence, deposited it under court protection, and instructed that it remain sealed until his son chose integrity over anger. Thomas never mentioned revenge. He never asked Calvin to destroy anyone. Instead, he asked only one thing. If you are hearing this, son, remember that truth is not valuable because it humiliates people. Truth matters because it gives honest families the chance to stand without fear. The room remained silent long after the recording ended. Claire slowly opened the journal, revealing detailed records, signed witness statements, and original surveys proving that dozens of property transfers had been manipulated before reaching the courthouse. The forged declaration of Calvin's death suddenly made perfect sense. As long as he officially did not exist, no lawful heir could ever claim the evidence or challenge the fraudulent chain of ownership. The chief judge immediately ordered the probate records frozen and instructed investigators to reopen every disputed filing connected to the journal. No celebration followed, only quiet accountability. Even the deputies standing near the doorway exchanged solemn glances as years of hidden decisions finally began to unravel. Claire turned toward Calvin with tears gathering in her eyes. I thought protecting these documents meant hiding them forever. Calvin gently closed the journal. Sometimes protecting something means trusting the right people with it. Evelyn lowered her head, not because the court had recognized the truth, but because she realized her husband had never stopped believing their son would eventually return. As everyone prepared to leave, the judge handed Calvin the property agreement. Your father never intended this to make you wealthy, she said softly. He intended it to give your family back its name. Calvin accepted the folder without opening it. His first thought was not about land or inheritance. It was about getting home before Nia woke up asking where he had been. As Claire gathered the remaining papers, a folded note slipped quietly from the final page of Thomas Brooks' journal. It was addressed in the same careful handwriting that Calvin had heard only moments earlier. This one did not bear his name. Across the front, it simply read, "For the person who brings my son home." Claire unfolded the final note with both hands, almost afraid the paper itself might disappear after surviving so many years. She read the first line silently before looking at Calvin with eyes filled not with surprise, but with quiet understanding. Then she handed him the letter. Thomas Brooks had written only a few paragraphs, yet every sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. He thanked the unknown person who would one day lead his son back to the front door he had once left behind. He wrote that forgiveness could never be forced, only invited, and that a family sometimes found its way home through strangers brave enough to perform one simple act of kindness without expecting anything in return. Calvin lowered the letter slowly. His thoughts returned to the rainy museum bench where he had almost driven past Claire without stopping. If he had been 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, none of this would have happened. The entire journey had begun because he chose compassion over convenience. By the time the morning sun reached the courthouse windows, investigators had already begun preserving the evidence Thomas had hidden. The legal process would continue for months, perhaps years, but that responsibility no longer belonged to Calvin alone. For the first time in decades, the truth rested in the hands of people whose duty was to protect it rather than bury it. Outside, Claire approached him before they parted. "You never asked what was inside the property agreement," she said. Calvin smiled gently. Because it stopped being the most important thing the moment I found my family again. Claire laughed softly through the tears she could no longer hide. Your father guessed that would be your answer. She reached into her coat pocket and returned the business card Adrian Mercer had left the night before. Calvin folded it once and quietly dropped it into the nearest recycling bin. Some chapters did not deserve space in anyone's pocket. Others deserved to remain only as lessons quietly left behind. Later that afternoon, Calvin finally opened the apartment door. Before he could say a word, Nia ran across the room and wrapped both arms around him. Miss Elena said you helped somebody again, she said proudly. Calvin knelt until they were eye level. Sometimes helping one person changes more lives than we ever expect. Nia nodded as though that answer made perfect sense, then reached into her backpack. I made something for Grandma. Calvin looked up in surprise as Evelyn stepped hesitantly through the doorway behind him, unsure whether she truly belonged there. Nia walked straight to her and held out a crayon drawing of 3 generations standing beneath a large oak tree. Above their smiling faces, she had written in careful block letters, "Family finds its way home." Evelyn's hands trembled as she accepted the picture. No speech followed. No dramatic apology erased the years they had lost. Instead, Calvin quietly moved aside, creating enough space for his mother to enter. It was the same silent gesture she had made on her front porch the night before, but now its meaning had changed completely. The door remained open. Rain no longer filled the air. Only the smell of fresh coffee, children's crayons, and the ordinary peace that every family hopes to find after a long journey. Calvin glanced once toward the old pickup parked outside, remembering the exhausted stranger he had simply refused to abandon. He finally understood that his father had been right. Sometimes the road home begins by taking someone else safely to theirs. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.